Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Born in Blood and Fire, a concise history of Latin America, 4th edition, by John Charles Chasteen, narrated by Gary Tiedemann. 1. Welcome to Latin America. Latin America was born in blood and fire, in conquest and slavery. It is conquest and its sequel, slavery, that created the central conflict of Latin American history. So that is where any history of the region must begin. On the other hand, conquest and slavery is old news, and partly, well, it's history. The Latin America of 2016 is no longer your father's version. Still, conquest and colonization form the unified starting place of a single story, told here with illustrative examples from many countries. We need a single storyline because rapid panoramas of 20 national histories would merely produce dizziness. And before beginning the story, we must set the stage in a number of ways. We need to ask, first of all, whether so many countries can really share a single history. At first blush, one might doubt it. Consider everything that story will have to encompass. Consider the contrasts and paradoxes of contemporary Latin America. Latin America is the global South, still struggling to attain the standard of living of Europe or the United States. It has deep roots in indigenous cultures. Most of the world's indigenous Americans, by far, live south of the Rio Grande. Yet, Latin America is also the West, a place where more than 9 out of 10 people speak a European language and practice a European religion. Most of the world's Roman Catholics are Latin Americans, which has much to do with the first non-European pope chosen in 2013 being Argentine. Some Latin Americans still grow corn and beans on small plots hidden among banana trees and dwell in earthen-floored houses with sagging red tile roofs. International travelers who jet in and out of sprawling Latin American metropolises rarely see them. You have to go to the countryside with its awful roads. Most Latin Americans these days live in noisy, restless cities, some of them postmodern megacities. Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, and Mexico City have far outstripped the 10 million mark. Rio de Janeiro, Lima, and Bogotá are not far behind. Next, consider the contrasts among countries. Brazil is a behemoth, occupying half the South American continent, its population surging beyond 200 million. Mexico follows at around 120 million. Thanks partly to their burgeoning internal markets, both countries' economies have even spawned their own multinational corporations. Colombia, Argentina, Peru, and Venezuela constitute a second rank, with populations between 30 and 50 million. Chile's population of 17 million carries disproportionate economic weight because of its high standard of living. The remaining, roughly 1/4 of Latin Americans, live in a dozen sovereign nations, most with populations under 10 million. In sum, the major Latin American countries are global players, though nothing like China or India, while many others are mini-states with a single city of consequence and 2 or 3 main highways. Latin American climates and landscapes vary more than you may realize. Most of Latin America lies in the tropics, with no well-defined spring, summer, fall, and winter. Many listeners of the global north will envision beaches replete with palms. Latin America's coastal lowlands do often match that description. But this tourist's eye view is misleading overall. Tropical highlands, cooled by their altitude, often semi-arid, have played a larger role in Latin American history. Mexico City stands above 7,000 feet, Bogota above 8,000. Latin American mountains are the world's most densely populated for historical reasons. Meanwhile, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, sometimes called the Southern Cone of South America, lie mostly or entirely outside the tropics, with climates similar to parts of the United States. The continent's craggy southern tip is a land of glaciers and Antarctic influences. Socially, Latin America is a place of extreme inequalities. Enormous disparities of wealth and well-being exist within countries and between them. Today, many Latin Americans live and work in circumstances not so different from those of middle-class people in the United States. But many, more than those who seem middle class by international norms, still inhabit hovels and endure a poverty and deprivation rare in the developed world. The Southern Cone countries have long stood respectably high in global rankings of social development, and most Latin American countries now hold middling rank globally in a combined measure of people's education, life expectancy, and buying power. The small countries of Central America, notably excepting Costa Rica, are worse off, as are those with large and historically oppressed populations of indigenous people, like Guatemala and Bolivia. Latin America is probably the most racially diverse of world regions, fed from the gene pools of Europe, Africa, and indigenous America. All three elements are present in every country, and the possible configurations vary kaleidoscopically. Guatemala and Bolivia, along with Peru and Ecuador, are characterized by large populations of indigenous people who continue to speak native languages such as Quechua or Aymara, live more or less separately from Spanish speakers, and follow distinctive customs in clothing and food. African genes are a predominant element of the mix in Brazil and on the shores of the Caribbean. Latin America was the main destination of the millions of people enslaved and taken out of Africa between 1500 and 1850. Whereas the United States received about 523,000 enslaved immigrants, Cuba alone got more. Brazil, at least 3.5 million. In addition, there are places in Latin America where people look notably European, particularly where large numbers of Italian immigrants were added to the population around 1900, such as in Argentina and Uruguay. Probably most Latin Americans consider themselves, to some degree, of mixed race, or mestizo, a key concept in Latin American history. Returning to our initial question, then, do these 20 countries in their startling variety really have a single history? No, in the sense that a single story cannot encompass their diversity. Yes, in the sense that all have much in common. They experienced a similar process of conquest and colonization. They became independent more or less the same way, mostly at the same time. They then struggled with similar problems in similar ways. Looking back after 2 centuries of independence, one sees that similar trends have washed over the entire region, giving Latin American history a well-defined ebb and flow. Not your father's version. Lately, it's been more flow than ebb. Enormous changes have come to Latin America in the 40 years since I traveled there for the first time, at the height of the Cold War. Yes, youngsters, that was before the Internet. Telephones and postal services worked poorly, or not at all, in many countries of Latin America. It was impossible to stay connected to the United States on a daily basis. One experienced total immersion. There was a hint of timelessness, too. Even still, the occasional burro or ox cart to glimpse from the view of a cross-country bus. Few rural dwellings had electricity or running water. The countryside seemed a feudal zone, dominated by large landowners who were rarely to be found on their rural estates because they lived in the cities. The poor people who did live in the countryside were amazingly isolated, although fairly well fed compared to the urban poor. I remember staying a few nights in a house that stood on an Andean mountainside, a 10 or 15-minute climb from the road, impassable by any sort of vehicle. The family who lived up there reckoned the hour by the sun, and the passage of 2 or 3 buses a day visible on the road that threaded a yawning chasm far below. An unimaginable variety of fruit grew around them, but any kind of store was half a day away. Rural-urban migrants had been flowing into Latin American cities for decades before my arrival, although the only accompanying construction boom had been the improvised housing that the migrants built for themselves. At the height of the Cold War, Latin American cityscapes still mostly resembled the 1940s or 1950s. There were no malls, or practically none, and few major infrastructural projects in the cities. There were few U.S. brand-named consumer goods for sale because high import tariffs made them too expensive for almost anyone. The idea was to protect and encourage local industries. There was already a rising tide of Asian imports, although not yet from China, which has become so suddenly a player in Latin America. Cold War China was Mao's China, where people wore only blue and rode only bicycles, and factories were a thing of the future. Latin America's high protective tariffs meant that imported blenders, televisions, and audio tape players had to be smuggled in, or sold in a variety of free trade venues created by various governments of the region in recognition of the inevitable. Before the era of inexpensive Asian manufactures, the clothing of Latin America's destitute millions was put together by hand and often seemed about to come apart at the seams, like the first pants that I had made in Colombia by a tailor who worked sitting in the doorway of his shop, the size of a large closet. The streets of cities were not studded with U.S. fast food franchises, as now, nor did they overflow yet with cars, which were too expensive for most people to own. Thus, there was no need, yet, to create laws keeping cars, with odd-numbered plates for example, off the road on certain days or hours, as many Latin American cities do today, for sheer lack of street space. Diesel-belching buses, yes, however, lots of those. Innovative bus rapid transit systems with dedicated high-speed lanes, such as the first one created in Curitiba, Brazil, and now recreated in a series of major Latin American cities, remained on the drawing board. There were few supermarkets in the richest parts of town, but most people did not buy food in supermarkets. Instead, there was a complex of open markets for produce and commodities, and neighborhood stores and bakeries for daily staples. In sum, Latin America's middle classes were smaller and much less Americanized than today. Strong trading blocs like NAFTA and Mercosur were decades away. Nobody had a cell phone until the 1990s, and many people had no telephone at all. Then, cell phone use rocketed in Latin American cities, precisely because landlines had always been scarce. At least in Colombia, where I first rented a place, you had a telephone in your house, or you didn't, period. Forget about getting one if you didn't, because state-run telephone companies rarely added lines. Houses were rented, bought, and sold with existing lines. A house with a telephone brought a better price, obviously. Before the era of plastic digital watches, a wristwatch of any kind was a prestige item in Latin America. People sometimes wore watches that didn't keep time, just to maintain their image. Few urban people seemed to possess a credit card, wear seatbelts, have insurance coverage, or fuss over their diet except to worry about their weight if they were women. No one had heard of multiculturalism or of threats to the rainforest. Sociology was for revolutionaries, and psychology was for the insane. Remittances from people working in the United States were not yet a major source of income in the region. Mexican immigration to the United States was growing, but not yet a flood, and Central American immigration had hardly begun. Large cities were well-known hotspots, but overall, street crime was moderate by comparison with recent decades. Yes, those were the good old days, for me anyway. I noticed, by the way people treated me, that I had become better looking. At greetings, I learned to embrace my buddies and shake hands with their girlfriends. The relationships between men and women seemed to me very old-fashioned and stylized. My first Spanish-language flirtations were supervised by dutiful younger sisters who were assigned to surveil me constantly. Fortunately, they could be bought off with money to go get a popsicle, or, better yet, go see a movie. In Mexico, at least, girls still did a lot of courting at the evening paseo, when people walked in circles around the town plaza, half in one direction and half in the other, occasionally switching so that everyone eventually saw everyone. Daytime park benches were full of teenagers kissing because young people didn't have cars. Wait, maybe that hasn't changed. The evening meeting place, on the other hand, was at the girl's house, under the watchful eye of her family, not inside, but at the doorway, or even, although this was pretty old-fashioned even then, at the window, he outside, she inside, separated by wrought iron bars. Companionate marriage, focused on the personal compatibility of the couple, was far from unknown, but didn't seem to prosper. Male infidelity was the rule rather than the exception. I'm not so sure how much has changed in that regard. But clearly, these days, middle-class women are much more likely to hold a job, and middle-class husbands are more likely to accept, at least in principle, that they ought to share household duties. Many thought patterns were quite conservative. People rarely went to Mass, but their Catholicism was automatic and unquestionable. Young people of a respectable family did not cohabit before marriage. The ubiquitous public presence of Catholic religious devotion had yet to be challenged by growing numbers of evangelical Christians. Perfectly ordinary middle-class people had live-in maids who earned an unbelievable pittance, inhabited by tiny windowless cubicles at night, and were treated, whether cruelly or kindly, as a different category of human being. Often they came from the country, where, it was believed, people were more honest and hard-working. Urban middle-class families with provincial roots might bring trustworthy servants with them to the city. City girls, even very poor ones, were unlikely to stay long as live-in maids, simply because they had more alternatives. So, savvy housewives with means preferred to hire country girls who didn't know their way around. Eventually, though, even the country girls found something less humiliating to do than being a servant. The muchacha of any age has walked out again, a perennial problem for the ama de casa. Only a tiny minority attended universities, and most who did studied to be lawyers, doctors, engineers, or architects. As students, they did not take part-time jobs waiting tables, for example, even if they needed the money. Class consciousness. Some were born to serve, apparently, others to be served. During the 1980s and afterward, those who were born to be served moved increasingly into high-rise apartment buildings or strongly enclosed apartment complexes with armed guards at the gate, an ugly reality that is likely to shock anyone who has never experienced it. At least, I would like to think so. This is the aspect of Latin America that most disturbed me personally, and it hasn't gone away. Still today, the expanding middle classes of Latin America are trying to raise perfect children in a defensive crouch. Although indicators of social well-being are improving, Latin America's distribution of wealth remains among the most unequal in the world. What nobody expects these days, however, is a revolution, and that's precisely what was expected of the Latin America I encountered in the 1970s. Revolutionary organizations spray-painted slogans on every available urban surface, featuring the Communist Party's hammer and sickle, the iconic visage of Che Guevara, and an alphabet soup of acronyms representing worker federations, guerrilla armies, and student organizations. Walls sprouted jagged crowns of broken glass embedded in concrete, as families with something to defend fortified themselves against the urban poor. A population explosion, as they named it, was underway when I got to Latin America. Latin American women had high fertility rates, and 20th century improvements in public health were lengthening life expectancies. Demographers read the tea leaves and foretold disaster. Hunger and deprivation on a vast scale seemed the inevitable result. The threat of impending social cataclysm hovered over everything. No one suspected that the women's interest in having lots of children would drop so precipitously as their horizons expanded in the cities. But that was happening by the 1980s, and today's Latin America's population is graying faster than it is growing. The future has a way of not turning out the way you expect. During the Cold War, when the Soviet Union rivaled the United States militarily, Latin America became a sort of battleground or geopolitical chessboard. Marxist guerrillas and nationalist regimes squared off against their own armed forces, which were allied with the U.S. military. That story will be told in detail toward the end of the book. Suffice it to say, for now, that since the Cold War, the region has seen sustained economic growth and political stability. But current free market growth seems to make the rich richer, the middle class more middle class, and the poor comparatively poorer. In Latin America, where the idea of a middle-class majority is not a reality, but rather a fond aspiration for the future, that kind of growth can produce more losers than winners. Winners and losers, rich and poor, conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves. That is the old conflict at the heart of Latin American history. Aspects of it go right back to 1492. Europeans no longer ride on the backs of indigenous porters, as they once did in Colombia, or in sedan chairs carried by African slaves, as in Brazil. But everywhere in Latin America, wealthier people still have lighter skin, and poorer people still have darker skin. The descendants of the Spanish, the Portuguese, and later European immigrants to Latin America still hold power, and the people who descend from slaves and subjugated Indians still serve them. Half a millennium later, this is clearly the enduring legacy, rippling across the centuries, of the fact that African, European, and indigenous American people did not come together on neutral terms, like various pedestrians arriving simultaneously at a bus stop. On the contrary, they have a history. To understand Latin America, you've got to understand that history. That's what this whole book is about. Here it is in a nutshell. In the 1550s, Spanish and Portuguese colonizers imposed their language, their religion, and their social institutions on indigenous Americans and enslaved Africans, people who labored for them in the mines and fields, and who served them too at table and in bed. After 3 centuries of this, things began to change, at least partly, when Latin American countries became independent. Independence created a string of the world's first constitutional republics in the 1820s. Henceforth, Latin American nations were to rule themselves. Rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Sound familiar? That was the plan, anyway. For most of 2 centuries, it didn't work very well. partly because of the weight of Latin America's conflictive history. Two political ideologies took center stage. The first was classical liberalism. You may need to acquire a new understanding of liberalism here. Notice that in Latin America, liberalism does not refer to the special concern for the welfare of disadvantaged people, as it does in the 21st century United States. Instead, liberalism means limited government and economic laissez-faire. This is a larger, more historical, more international use of the word liberalism, referring, in short, to the core principles of the U.S. Constitution, a complex of values and practices that developed in the 1600s and 1700s, largely in France and England. Some call it classical liberalism. Liberal ideology favored progress over tradition, reason over faith, universal over local values, and the free market over government control. In principle, at least, liberals espoused equality of citizenship over entrenched privilege and lauded representative democracy over all other forms of government. Both 1776 and 1789, marking the American and French revolutions, are landmark dates in world liberalism. Latin American liberals have generally been friends of the United States and of international capitalism. Today's neoliberals, discussed in the last chapter, are a case in point. Neoliberals want Latin America to get with the globalization program. Latin American liberals have almost always been oriented toward European or U.S. models, and that goes double for today's neoliberals. Overall, the European and U.S. experience with liberalism has produced prosperity. The liberal state and its economic adjunct, free market capitalism, currently constitute the universal model for modernity in the global West. Latin America's actual experience with liberalism and capitalism, on the other hand, has been mixed, as we will hear. Unfettered economic laissez-faire has rarely produced durable, equitable prosperity in Latin American countries. Rather, it has tended to further empower and benefit people already at the top of these starkly stratified societies. Sometimes it has created nightmare scenarios. The second emerging political ideology, liberalism's great challenger in Latin America, was nationalism. Here is another big historical idea to fine-tune in your thinking, especially if you tend to regard nationalism simply as a threat to free trade. Over the last 2 centuries, the surface of the entire globe has been converted from kingdoms and empires into sovereign nations, a breathtaking transformation. Nationalism is thus a major theme in modern world history, sometimes destructive, sometimes constructive. In a nutshell, nationalism is the idea that everyone ought to be part of a nation, and that nations should rule themselves. The last part makes nationalism the basic ideology of decolonization around the world. The first part, about everyone belonging, links ruling elites to the people they rule, and also links the ruled to each other. The stronger those links are, the stronger the nation. Nationalism is neither right nor left on the political spectrum. In Latin America, nation-building has been a long-term project carried out over the entire 19th century in artistic circles, government ministries, and eventually public schools. In the 20th century, nationalism has rallied the masses and challenged liberal values like free trade. Nationalists want Latin America to follow a different drummer. Resisting outside control and influence has always been one of their strongest impulses. Nationalists counter the appeal of universal models of modernity with an appeal to national uniqueness and authenticity. They think in terms of a national family, which must take care of its own, especially its weaker members. Some Latin American nationalists are conservatives who value local traditions, most especially religious ones. Today, however, most Latin American nationalists are socialists or social democrats who stand to the left of liberals on the political spectrum.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?